So tenant fee ban, guys, I've thrown this in here because the transition period came to an end on the 31st of May during the pandemic. So this, the tenant fee ban came into force on the 1st of June 2019. What a nightmare for agents, what a nightmare for landlords. But the transition period is now over. So this is really just a reminder, guys, to say to you, please bear in mind now that you are not allowed, you or any agent, because this is a total ban that applies to landlords and agents, are not allowed to take any payment from a tenant for arranging the granting, the renewal, the continuation, or the termination of a tenancy. This is for assured short-hold tenancies, okay? So ASTs, it doesn't apply to company lets. So if you let a property to a company, you could still charge them an admin fee. But ASTs, which is the majority of our business, you can no longer charge the tenant a referencing fee. You can't charge them a contract fee. You can't charge them an admin fee. You can't charge them a renewal fee. You can't charge them a checkout fee. You can't charge them an inventory fee. You can't charge them anything to set up that tenancy. It's very, very important. And the penalties under tenant fee ban is frightening. Okay, so this, as you can see from my slide, this includes landlords, and the legislation is out there and includes landlords. So if you're found to fall foul of this piece of legislation, you may well you will face the same penalties as us as agents. And I've just put this in there at the bottom because what a lot of agents were thinking of doing, not necessarily landlords, was charging a higher rent in month one. So if the rent was £500 and their admin fees normally 300 quid, they were going to charge £800 for the first month and £500 thereafter. That was very quickly jumped upon and banned, and part of the legislation now states that you can't charge a higher rent in month one. The good news is, guys, though, they did allow some payments. For those of you that have been at my seminars before, I always make a joke about this because the first draft piece of legislation, rent was actually a prohibited payment, which meant you couldn't charge it. So thankfully, that was very, very quickly changed, and you can still charge the tenants what is on my slide now. You can charge the tenants rent, and you can charge the tenants utilities. What that means by charging the tenant's utilities is that you can make the tenant liable and responsible for the supplies to your property. That is very normal. But one of the questions that came to me not very long ago, actually, and I think it was Ali that asked me, was I've come across a landlord that has, it was actually a HMO, and he has meters in each room, and the tenants top up their electric using cards, the old-fashioned way. Now, they buy the cards off the landlord, and the landlord makes a little bit of profit on top. That is actually illegal because you're making a secret profit from the utilities. So that isn't allowed. So please just bear that in mind. If you are including bills, you can only ever charge a tenant. If you're paying for the electric and then you're going to bill the tenant separately for it, you can only bill them the actual usage that they're liable for. So just bear that in mind and don't fall foul to that. With the tenant fee ban, they also gave us some more devastating news that they were going to cap tenancy deposits. So prior to the tenant fee ban, we were able to take any amount of deposit that we wanted. Most common across the UK was 6 weeks. But in other cases where there was a greater risk, if you were accepting a tenant that might not have quite passed referencing, there was just a bit more of a higher risk with that person. You didn't have a cap on the amount of deposit that you can take, but now, unfortunately, you do. It is capped at 5 weeks. And I want to say this, and I should have actually put it on the slide. I wonder if I have. Did I put on the calculation? Because just yesterday I had a call from somebody, and the calculation that they'd used for the 5-week deposit was wrong. You must make sure that you calculate the monthly rent times 12 divided by 52 times 5. Do not divide the monthly rent by 4 and add 1 week onto the month, because that would be too much deposit. You would be in receipt of what's called a prohibited payment, and you would be liable for a fine. You can still take a holding deposit from tenants if you wish to show financial commitment. but there is a lot of restraints surrounding this, and the amount that you can take is capped at 1 week. Using the same calculation as the deposit, it would be monthly rent times 12 divided by 52 gives you the 1 week's holding deposit. Now, you can charge specific tenant default fees, but there's a condition that these must be in your tenancy. And you can also still charge specific tenant request fees, which I'm going to cover in more detail shortly. Okay, so specific tenant request fees. So if a tenant's already in your property and they are, let's say they're in a 12-month contract and they moved in March and they now want to leave, their circumstances have changed and they want to leave. This is called early termination of a tenancy, and this can no longer be reasonably withheld by a landlord, okay? So you cannot reasonably withhold consent to agree to an early termination of tenancy, but there are some criteria and costs that the tenant must cover. So if the tenant wants to break their contract early, first and foremost, they must pay rent until a new tenant is found. That is on the proviso that you as the landlord or your agent, if you're using one, is remarketing the property and making every effort to find a new tenant. If it's just that you can't find a new tenant because the market is not very buoyant. So for example, early termination during Corona, well, that was just really challenging because we couldn't even do viewings of a property. That's not your fault, and therefore, they are still liable until the new tenant moves in. You can also charge them reasonable reletting costs as well. So if you're using an agent, and let's just keep the figures simple, if they're charging you £500 to find a new tenant, and let's say the tenancy started in June and in July they want to leave, it would be very reasonable to expect them to cover the full cost of your relettings fees, because your agent's going to charge you again because they have to do the same amount of work. And it's very reasonable to pass the full amount of that cost on to the tenant because they are only 30 days into a contract. Let's say, however, the tenancy started in March and it's due to expire in March of next year, and the tenants wanted to leave in January. If the tenants want to leave in January, they're only breaching the contract and leaving 2 months early. So if they've given normal notice and left at the end of contract, you would have had to pay that £500 fee anyway. So the fact that they're only doing it 2 months early means really a reasonable charge to the tenant would be a proportion of your setup cost. Hopefully that makes sense to everybody. Unfortunately, the government likes the word reasonable, but they never give you a definition of what that means. If a tenant wants to change a sharer, so if Mr. and Mrs. is living in a property and then one of them separates and there's a new contract needed, you can charge the tenants £50 inclusive of VAT. All of these charges are inclusive of VAT where they're capped. You can charge a tenant because it's at their request that they are asking you to make changes to the contract, and therefore that fee can be levied. A novation of contract is also a permitted payment, capped at £50. Novation of contract means a change of contract. So if the contract needs to be done for whatever reason, if there is a new, so for example, if the tenant wants to add a pet to it, if the tenant wants to redecorate and you feel it essential to put that into the contract, anything that requires a change in the contract at the tenant's request, you can charge for, capped again at £50. Deposit replacement schemes are permitted. So there's some fantastic deposit replacement schemes out there at the moment, offering 12 weeks of protection rather than the capped 5 weeks. But you cannot make this, you can only offer this if it's an optional. So for example, if I want to apply for your property, you cannot say to me, Dawn, you can apply, but you have to use the deposit replacement scheme. You have to say to me, Dawn, great, you can apply. This is the option with regards to the deposit. You can either pay me a 5-week cash deposit. Thank you very much. There's my tea just on cue. You can either pay me a 5-week deposit, or you have a deposit replacement scheme. The choice is yours. Which one would you like? So hopefully, guys, that all makes sense. Now on to the default fees. Okay, so these are if your tenant defaults or if they do something wrong in the contract, what can you now charge for? Rent arrears. Right, you'll be really pleased to know, landlords, get your hands rubbed together because you're going to be absolutely loaded with the amount that you can charge a tenant for rent arrears. It has been capped at 3% above base rate, which currently means 3.75%. It can only be charged after the tenant has been in arrears for 14 days. And I think on average, a rent of about £5.50 means £3.40 a month. Not very much. Hardly worth charging. So just please bear this in mind. If you or your agent or anybody used to charge late fees, you can't do that anymore. You'll be breaking the law, and you will be in receipt of a prohibited payment. The one that comes up quite often is lost keys, or I've locked myself out. I need you to come and visit me. I need you to bring the keys. First and foremost, you're not obligated. If the tenant loses the keys, locks himself out, that's not your fault. If you are happy to, go over and take the keys, for example, you can do so. If you wanted to drop the spare keys off, just bear in mind though that if it is just time that you're charging for, it is capped at £15 an hour. If, however, you're instructing a contractor to change the locks and it's a locksmith, you can levy the full cost of the invoice from the contractor. Bear in mind, though, that you can't make a commission off that if you are doing so. So please bear that in mind. It's really, really important that you do not take a prohibited payment, guys. The penalties are huge, and I'm going to go into them very shortly. Now, everything that I've just said to you, in order to be enforceable in terms of chargeable, must be written into your AST. So if you're using tenancy agreements that, in fact, you're going to need new tenancy agreements anyway, update your tenancy agreements, because there's been so many legislations that have come into force that they need to be considered within the tenancy agreement. Please look at that, because these need to be, and in particular, the most costly one is most likely to be your early termination. So make sure that you have that clause in your tenancy agreement. There are two exemptions. The non-Housing Act tenancies and company-let tenancies are also not applicable, and therefore there's no cap on the deposits. Holding deposits, as I said, are capped at 1 week's rent. Some of the key factors to remember: agents and landlords can only take one holding deposit at any one time, and can only be held for up to 15 days. If you extend that past the 15 days because they haven't entered into the tenancy agreement, you must do so in writing. Why is it so important that you only take one at any one time? Because if you take two, both payments will be deemed as prohibited. And if you are then penalised, your penalty wouldn't be £5,000, it would be 10, because you have two prohibited payments, not one. Taking the second payment makes both payments prohibited. Really, really important. It can go towards rent or deposit, but I recommend it goes towards rent, and that is just purely to avoid the deposit regulation issues that you may have if it goes over the 30 days. You can keep holding deposits, but you can only do so if the landlord, if the tenant pulls out. If they change their mind, you can keep the holding deposit. If they fail a right to rent check, you can keep the holding deposit. If they give you false or misleading information, then you can keep the holding deposit. If they don't enter into the tenancy agreement within 15 days because they haven't provided you references or their ID, you can keep the holding deposit. But if you do keep the holding deposit, you must confirm the reason for retaining to them in writing within 7 days. Very important. Now, it must be returned to the tenant if you or an agent pulls out. So if an agent says, "Oh, I'm not dealing with this no more," or if a landlord says, "I don't want to go ahead with you no more, I'm sorry, I've just got a bad feeling," you have to give them their money back, even if you've done referencing. If the tenant fails referencing but hasn't told a lie to you, so for example, if you ask me to fill out a form and I say, "Yes, I've got bad credit, I've got 10 grand's worth of county court judgments," you then say to me, "I'm not accepting you because you've got 10 grand's of county court judgments." You can't keep my holding deposit because I've told you the truth and you knew that before taking it. So if the tenant has told the truth on the application form and then fails, you can't keep hold of the deposit. So to recap, there's a 5-week cap on security deposits. New tenancies can only have a 5-week cap, so 5 weeks maximum for all new tenancies. Renewals of tenancy: if you have renewed your tenancy since the 1st of June 2019 and you were holding a higher amount of deposit, you must have reduced that to 5 weeks maximum. If you haven't, you have been in breach of the tenant fee ban legislation and you are in receipt of a prohibited payment, and I suggest you do so immediately. The only time you can keep the higher deposit is if your tenancy goes into a contractual rolling tenancy, because at that point there is no requirement to reduce the deposit amount. But if it's a statutory rolling tenancy, bear in mind that's deemed as a new tenancy, and you will need to reduce the amount of the deposit. Very, very important, guys. If you haven't checked, if you think it might be you, please do get on your laptops now, have a look. Well, not now, at 8:30 when I finish, but have a look, guys. Please don't fall foul to these, because look at these penalties. £5,000 per offence for the first offence, and that goes up to £30,000 per offence for every offence in the next 5 years. These penalties, guys, were designed to bankrupt agents. This was designed to bankrupt agents that didn't want to abide by the legislation, and I support this because we have abided by this legislation, as we do every piece of legislation, where some other agents that are not as compliant don't. It is absolutely there to cripple people. Do not fall foul to this. And very, very importantly, you cannot serve Section 21 notice if you are in receipt of a prohibited payment. So if you have got a deposit that is higher than it's meant to be and you've served notice, I tell you now, when you get to court in 9 months' time, that notice will be invalid. So very, very, very important. It's also a criminal offence and can come with a banning order.